Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. We're excited to have over 400 registered attendees for today's webinar, which is eligible for 1 credit from the ACI. Let's get started by giving one lucky attendee a Webinar Wednesday lunch bag for answering this trivia question. Today's sponsor, Asimily, is headquartered in California. Name the actor who was the only California governor to ever become United States President. Answer now using the questions feature on your dashboard. While you're answering, I want to invite everyone to join us for the full MD Expo conference, which will bring HTM professionals from across the nation to Seattle from October the 5th to 7th for 3 days of learning, networking, and the latest advances in technology, products, and services. Registration is now open. More details can be found at mdexposhow.com/Seattle. Okay, and let's see who the winner of our Webinar Wednesday lunch bag is. And it is Larry Stevens. Congratulations, Larry. The correct answer is Ronald Reagan. Webinar Wednesday would like to thank our sponsor, Asimily. Asimily is a team with backgrounds in healthcare, security, machine learning, and analytics. The team has built and launched solutions for connected devices in healthcare in their previous roles. Asimily currently provides a medical device asset and cybersecurity management platform. Asimily's solution currently helps providers understand all aspects of their inventory, discovers device relationships, does risk monitoring and mitigation, and finally provides an ability to prioritize patching and mitigation, providing alternatives to patching where available. For more information, visit asimily.com. Our presenter today is Shankar Somasundaram, co-founder and CEO at Asimily. Shankar, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. I am Shankar, CEO and co-founder of Asimily. Asimily, like was mentioned, is focused on healthcare. A quick background about myself. So prior to starting Asimily, I used to run the connected device business at healthcare at Symantec with a focus on healthcare. And as part of the role, I have been involved with medical devices and medical device security since 2012. I contributed to the FDA draft guidelines that I'm sure most of you are aware of on medical devices in 2014 and 2016. I contributed to the AMI medical device cybersecurity book that came out a few months ago. And I have been I have spent a lot of time with medical device manufacturers and different healthcare providers over the last many years. So what I'm going to talk about today on medical device management with a focus on cyber risk and cybersecurity is a topic I've been looking at for the last, I would say 7 years. And so everything I'm saying today is a culmination of things I have learned over the last many years. Now, before I talk about, what are the different aspects of medical device management, I want to start with some of the unique challenges in healthcare. And I'm sure all of you guys, many of you guys at least are very aware of those, but I just want to go over it. And healthcare is fairly complex. I have been looking at, I have looked at different verticals. I have looked at industrial, which comes closest to healthcare in complexity. I spent obviously many years with IT security and IT operations, and a couple of things. And healthcare is unique because it's one vertical where a number of different things come together. So to begin with, there are a large number of unsupported legacy devices. I have seen healthcare providers where you have devices which are running, for 10 years, 15 years. You have operating systems. People talk about Windows XP, but I have seen operating systems like Windows NT 4.0, which is very old, closer to the DOS versions. And I've even seen older Windows 95 in a couple of places, especially on the connected device side within the healthcare environment. So there's a lot of legacy in these environments. There's huge heterogeneity. Healthcare providers can have seen anywhere from a small to mid-sized provider can have like a few hundred medical device manufacturers or suppliers, and to really large providers can have even 1,000 or a couple of thousand manufacturers is the maximum I've seen. And then within that, each of these manufacturers can have many different device types And then within the device types, there can be many different models. So it's a very heterogeneous environment, more than most other verticals I have ever seen. There are a lot of constraints in healthcare. You cannot just ping or scan many of these devices. And this is something I always tell the IT side in the healthcare provider that, hey, you cannot just scan many of these devices. You're going to topple them over. And you have to be careful in how you deal with them, because unlike IT devices, medical devices have constraints, both in technology and as well as regulatory, in how you can deal with the data and what you can do with it. There is a lot of unique protocols, data sources, and regulations in healthcare. I mean, all of these different medical devices, many of them talk their own language. They also have different, there are outside of the network in the hospital, there are a variety of other data sources, which is where I mentioned the metadata or the information about the device is widely distributed. So people talk a lot about how they can gather information from the network. Now that is an important source. But there is information about your devices, in different online sources, which you can extract through research. It's in the form of documents like MDS2. It's in the form of databases like your CMMS. So there is information about the device that's widely distributed, which if you aggregate, you can get a much more insightful and much more powerful view. And then there are these non-medical, which are just IoT or connected devices, the more popular term for those. Which are any other device that are in your environment. They could be the IP camera that's moving around. They could be the medical printer. But these are non-traditional medical, but they contribute to the operation of the healthcare facility or the provider, and they're part of your overall environment. And because of this complexity, a lot of providers we see have to deal with limited visibility. And visibility is a big area. So people usually refer to visibility as, I need to know the devices that are there in my environment. So that is one aspect of visibility and knowing all their parameters. But there is other aspects to it as well. Knowing how these devices are behaving is also a visibility. Knowing how the devices are getting utilized is also a visibility issue. So visibility is a broad-ranging topic, right from what devices exist all the way to how they are being utilized. Too many devices to patch. Now, I would say after visibility, patching is probably the biggest issue most providers face. And there are a variety of issues here. I mean, because of the heterogeneity, because of the legacy, almost everything seems to have a vulnerability from a cybersecurity perspective. So what do I patch? How do I patch it? Does the manufacturer have a patch? If the manufacturer does not have a patch, what do I do about it? So I see healthcare providers constantly firefighting this problem and constantly reacting and saying, oh, what is the next problem, and trying to solve it. And so there is a constant amount of pressure on this one. And it's because of all the problems I mentioned earlier. And then finally, there is limited security optics because traditional IT security tools don't always provide the same kind of insight into medical devices. So there is a struggle to understand what's happening. And all of it leads to a constant lack of understanding, which leads to some level of operational inefficiency, which is what I'm going to talk about on what the potential path forward might be. So to address the problem, I see it as 3 steps. Step 1, and I'm specifically looking at it from a medical device cyber program. So there are 3 steps to it. Step 1 is really to identify all the devices and the parameters. I'm sure many of people in this call think about that as the first step as well. Step 2 is really proactively identifying where the risk lies in your network and mitigating them. Now, this goes back to the patching point I mentioned, but instead of going and addressing all of them, I'm going to talk about how do you prioritize, how do you proactively identify, prioritize, and mitigate. And step 3 is then you monitor them, you baseline the behavior, and you manage the device network access. So you know everything is going on fine in your environment. Now, I want to take an analogy. So now for each of these 3 steps, I have 3 slides. So I can explain a little bit about each of these 3 steps. But before I go into those 3 slides for each step, I want to use an analogy to explain especially the difference between 2 and 3. So imagine you have a beautiful house. I'm sure all of you have a beautiful house. So imagine you have a beautiful house which is analogous to a hospital, and you want to make sure everything is fine, it's all secure, everything is good. So what are the things you're going to do about it? The first step, which is step 1, you have to know what's in the house, all your belongings, all your personal stuff, what's there, where they are placed. So you have a good understanding of what's there in your environment before you even think about securing what's there in the house. So that's step one, identifying everything in your environment. Now, step two, now you want to secure it. Now you can do two things. You can place a camera at one corner of the house or many corners, and you can continuously monitor what's happening in your house, so that if someone enters who's not supposed to and tries to take something, you can immediately catch them and flag it, and then call the cops or do whatever. But that's a very reactive way of securing your personal belongings and your assets. And that's what step three talks about, that you're continuously monitoring, you're figuring out what's happening, and you're throwing an alarm and then blocking or doing something when something unintentional or malicious happens in your house or in your environment. Step two says you have to be more proactive. And proactive is, if you have that house, you're not just going to put that camera in there. You are also going to identify what are the doors and windows to which someone can enter. And maybe you have like 15 windows in your house. You probably don't worry about everything. You're going to pick the key ones where people are going to enter from or potentially enter from. And you're going to put some lock around it, or you're going to put some security around it, for lack of a better word. And you are going to make sure that that is secure. And that's what step two is in terms of proactively identifying risks and mitigating them. You might still put the camera, but you are always going to make sure that your door is locked and certain key windows are locked or taken care of, because otherwise, it doesn't matter how many cameras are there, you're going to have problems in the future. So step one is identifying. Step two is that proactive measure that you got to take, identifying the doors and windows to which someone can enter. And then step three is really continuously monitoring to proactively identify and mitigate. So let me start with each of these three steps and go a little more detail into them. So let's start with step one. So inventory, as we all understand, is really the first step to understanding your overall environment and even the first step to doing any kind of analysis. And to do inventory, people talk about inventory. So I want to mention what are the components of inventory that you really need to get. So the first one is all the IT and software parameters. These are things like IP, MAC, port, protocol, services, operating system, host name, all of those which would classify as IT and software parameters for the device. Medical device parameters are things like manufacturer, device type, brand of the device, wherever possible, serial number, software version. Cybersecurity capabilities are, does it do encryption? Does it do transport level encryption? Does it do endpoint security? Maybe does it do logging? And a variety of other factors. And then there are a couple of other points. So the first three that I mentioned are specific to the device. The direct and indirect relationship goes one step forward and looks at how the device is located in the environment. So it looks at the device relationships, which is the device it's connected to, how is it connected to, is it directly connected to something, is it indirectly connected to something. So it looks at all your relationships in your environment. And that is important because I always say healthcare is not just a system, it's a system of systems. So it's an environment where there are many interconnected devices, many interconnected systems, which is what makes the operation possible, which also makes complexity higher. So you have to know these direct and indirect relationships. And you have to understand how the data is flowing. Wherever possible, if you understand what kind of data is flowing, not just what is connected to, but what kind of data is flowing, then you have a good understanding of how data is flowing in your environment, and that will help with regulatory purposes. And when you have all of this is what I call like a master data record about the device, because now you have everything you want to know about the device, both in terms of the device properties itself, as well as how the device is connected in your environment and how the device is located in your environment itself. Now, the challenge is, a lot of people, and this especially goes to the IT side and sometimes even the clinical side of the house. A lot of people say, why can't I use my traditional tools? And the reason is because a lot of traditional tools are built for IT devices. So they effectively work differently, and I just want to classify that. So with IT devices, they can be scanned and interrogated. So you can go scan an IT device and you can get all the information. Whereas with medical devices, most medical devices, active scanning may produce some form of undesired response. And that undesired response could be anything from, it just crashes. That's not good, of course. So it probably just behaves abnormally for some time. So it could have any kind of undesired behavior. And even though newer classes of medical devices seem more resilient, even many of them don't seem to be able to have the ability to withstand a scan. like the way a traditional IT laptop or server can withstand the scan or take a scan. A lot of IT devices can correctly identify and present themselves. So when you see an IT like a Dell or a HP, you know that's a Dell or HP. But many of the medical devices, especially your imaging, for example, many of them will appear on the network as like a Dell or a HP hardware. And so discerning that from the fact that it's really a medical device, and maybe even what kind of medical device, maybe the kind of manufacturer is important. So a traditional IT tool might not always help you solve that problem. And the last piece is network representation is complete. So basically whatever, because you can scan it partly and because the way they represent themselves, you generally will get a very comprehensive, accurate view of your IT device. Now, medical devices, even with the best of tools, there could be gaps in information on the network because, some of these medical devices are old. They don't actually follow the standard very well. Some of them follow the standard, but they don't transmit the information. So, every manufacturer, there are like 4,000 manufacturers in healthcare. Every manufacturer designs slightly differently. And so there can be differences. And so you might need to supplement or append this information with many different complementary sources. And so I just want to add the third slide is what's the current state here is that there have been a number of solutions now. I mean, healthcare, you have seen an emergence of a number of solutions which can do this kind of network detection and parsing. And then some of them can even go one step forward and integrate with different CMMS systems and then correlate with that information, whether it is based on IP, based on MAC, based on serial number, or they can correlate based on manufacturer and brand and have a two-way exchange of information. And I would say some solutions, including Asimily, can go even one step even more and then also pull information from different sources, whether it's own databases or whether it's from sources like MDS2 to further enhance and augment the inventory information that you find on the network, right? So when you combine all of this, you probably can get a fairly solid picture of what's in your environment. And this is important because from what at least we have seen, visibility remains the number one challenge in healthcare environments. Now, of course, the problem is still something that people are continuing to improve on because, like I said, because medical devices aren't built like IT, there is no single solution that is that can get every last piece of information for every last device. There are always going to be some gaps. So this is going to be an evolving process, and this will require some level of closer cooperation in the industry as well to finally solve it completely. So with that, and I'm going to do this kind of 3 slides for the next 2 areas as well. So with that, I want to move into the topic of the second step, which is assessing and mitigating cyber risk proactively. So here, I want to take a step back and say that this is a topic which is I see often in healthcare providers where there is a lot of push from the IT side saying, hey, we have vulnerabilities all over your medical devices, and they ask the clinical guys, what are you doing about that? Hey, there is a Windows XP, when are we going to remove that from the network? Or, hey, can we just upgrade the Windows XP? We have like 50 Windows XP, let's just go buy new X-ray machines next year and take care of it. Now that approach works in IT because in the world of IT, when you have a vulnerability, you can just go, do a patch Tuesday or patch Friday or whatever patch you want to do, and then go do an automatic patching for all your IT devices, and that will solve all your problems. And you can just do a uniform update on all your devices and you're done. But in the world of medical devices, that's not going to happen, like because of the heterogeneity and variety of other factors I spoke about. So you have to take a very different approach to assessing risk. Because otherwise, like I mentioned, you'd be firefighting. So this outlines what are the things you need to look at when you understand what is the risk in your environment. So the first step is obviously start with the vulnerabilities. So you have to understand what are the vulnerabilities in the environment. And that is really the first step. And the vulnerability could be different kinds. It could be an operating system vulnerability. So you might be a vulnerability in a Windows XP. What kind of vulnerabilities exist in Windows XP. It could be a vulnerability in the application, like let's say you're running Word or Internet Explorer. What kind of vulnerabilities are there in the application? It could be a vulnerability that is unique to a device published by the manufacturer. So let's say there's a manufacturer, X or G, or whoever, right? GE, Philips, Siemens, whoever it might be, they might have published a vulnerability for a particular brand of their device. And so you have to understand what those vulnerabilities are and whether they affect your device. So step one, of course, is to know what are the vulnerabilities in the device itself. Step two is an important step, because not every vulnerability, even if it's present on the device, and you would hear the manufacturer say it many times as well, but not every vulnerability that is present on the device can be exploited. There are certain vulnerabilities which might be present on the device, but it's just very difficult for an attacker to exploit it. And there could be many reasons. One of the reasons is the way the device is configured on the network. And so it could have, for example, there could be a vulnerability that is only exploitable when you do RDP, a remote desktop. But maybe the device is not doing RDP anywhere, or the vulnerability or the device is doing a remote desktop only to certain trusted locations. So in that case, the vulnerability might not be exploitable. That particular vulnerability might not be exploitable on that particular device, right? And so the other vulnerabilities might be exploitable. So you have to understand what is the configuration of the device to understand that even if a vulnerability is present, is it even going to affect you? Is it even a problem in the first place? Once you do that, and you think that the vulnerability is a problem, then you have to understand the impact of the device, impact of the vulnerability. Now, unlike IT devices, not every device has the same impact. So you have to understand what the impact is in terms of patient care, in terms of data, in terms of business. And that is a function of not only what the device is, but also is it connected to some server which is important, and so on. So you have to look at the impact in different dimensions to understand that even if there is a vulnerability which potentially poses a problem, does it pose a high risk in your environment? And that is the entire impact potential that you have to understand for that vulnerability, for that device. So this is highly specific to your environment, to your device in that environment. Then the next thing is you have to understand the topology of the device. How is the device connected in your environment? Because you can have a device which is, let's say, very secure. It's a great device, very well secured. It has a lot of controls on it, but it could be connected to a server which is highly insecure. And so that kind of opens up the Pandora box for that device. Whereas the vice versa can also be true, where you can have a highly insecure device, which is fairly hard to penetrate because of how it's connected in your environment. And so that obviously will have a risk, but the risk profile can change based on how it's connected in your environment, either way, for good or for bad. And then the final thing is, as much as possible, you have to know the security capabilities. When you understand the security capabilities, you will find that some potential, I know manufacturers are vilified for not doing enough, but some of the manufacturers do put some basic level of controls on the device, and some of those controls can help mitigate certain kinds of vulnerabilities. So you might look at certain kinds of vulnerabilities and say, hey, the vulnerability exists, but the way it is exploitable, the way it can be exploited is going to be mitigated by this particular security capability. So maybe the risk is not that high for this vulnerability, specific vulnerability. So knowing that security capability on the device allows you to understand whether or not certain kinds of issues on the device are mitigated. And you can also include security capabilities on the network as part of it and say, okay, that might further mitigate certain risks, right? And so when you know all of these five each of these you have to analyze, but when you know all of these areas and then you kind of analyze all of them together, you would realize that a lot of your medical devices, which you deemed as high risk or which are deemed as vulnerable, potentially is not such a big issue in your network. And now you have the data to go and tell maybe the IT risk manager or even to validate to yourself that there is a subset of devices that you really need to focus on. And generally, when you add a lot of this medical device context, you do find that the number of devices and number of vulnerabilities that you have to focus on is a far lower number than you would otherwise do. Now, again, if you look at IT versus medical, now this is again a topic that comes up a lot in healthcare because people generally say, hey, I use my, vulnerability scanner. I scanned all my devices. I'm good. We are done. We know all the problems in your environment. And like I said, that's going to throw you off because pretty much everything's going to throw a vulnerability. And so that's true in IT. It's a measure of risk. But in medical devices, like I already mentioned, it doesn't really reflect device risk. You have to consider many other factors. Again, the scoring itself, I mean, you have something called the CVSS. Some of you might be aware, some not, but there is something called the CVSS, which the risk framework guys use in medical devices. They use the base score to identify the severity of it. But in the world of medical devices, you have to look at many other factors. And this is not just me saying, I mean, if you look at a number of risk frameworks that have been published for medical devices, they talk about similar things, that if you want to understand, and the FDA guidelines also kind of alludes to it, that you have to account for a number of aspects, including impact to patient data and business, and other factors that I mentioned. And then the last point is actually equally important. I didn't touch upon it so far, but once a vulnerability is identified in the world of IT, you can, like I said, you have a patch, day, whatever, and you just patch everything, and you can do it in an automated way, just download patches and do it. And there are tools for doing that. But in the world of medical, because of the heterogeneity, because of a variety of reasons, you cannot do that. And so here you have to, in many cases, see, and in many cases, the manufacturer might not have a patch, and might not have a patch because maybe the patch slows down the device and they don't want to release it. Or maybe they have to validate the patch and it takes them months on end to validate the patch. And so you have to find an alternative. And what I see is many healthcare providers, the alternative is let's just disconnect the device completely from the network and let's just keep it on the side. And that is the alternative. And whether that's 6 months, 1 year. And that can lead to more challenges because now you have many devices connected. There's one device is not connected. And so it kind of, you have to deal with it differently. But there are alternatives to patching, and just segmentation is not necessarily an alternative because there are issues around segmentation I'll talk about. But you might say that for that given vulnerability, if I understand how it can be exploited on the network, then maybe just for that vulnerability, I can do some configuration that mitigates that critical vulnerability, which is causing the problem. So there can be alternatives to patching if you go more granular, which can effectively allow you to operate that device on the network without necessarily having to just disconnect it, or without having to worry about the fact that a patch might not be available from the manufacturer for a while. And this actually might be even more practical in some cases, because if you have too many devices of a given kind, rolling out a patch itself, sometimes providers take like a few months. Sometimes the rollout is not like in a day or two, it can take 3 months, 6 months. We have seen that. So sometimes having an alternative might be more practical in the short term till the patch rollout happens over all your devices. And so if you look at the current state, now this is an area where I think there's a lot more evolution still happening. I mean, the most solutions we see still focus on vulnerabilities or anomalies as a measure of risk. But there are newer solutions that have emerged which take a similar proactive, contextual and dynamic risks that I have mentioned. And when you do that, we see that only 10 to 20% of the devices which are effectively seen as high risk by the provider in their environment, or which would effectively be seen as having a vulnerability, are really at risk. And this could include a lot of Windows XP. Many times we have seen that people complain, oh, I have like 20, 50, whatever number of Windows XP potentially in my environment. And we see that maybe only a few of them or none of them, or maybe a subset of them are at risk. Majority of them are not really posing that kind of a risk in that environment. And then among those 10 or 20% of the devices which potentially pose a risk, more than 50% are really high-risk devices, which are workstations and servers, which are connected to the medical device itself. And this is a very interesting thing we have noticed when you do this kind of proactive risk analysis. And this is also intuitive, because what happens is that the medical devices itself are, configured tightly. They're generally hardened to do only certain actions. So, a lot of vulnerabilities might still be there on that old XP imaging machine, but because of the way it's configured, the risk levels might be low. Whereas a lot of those workstations, the imaging workstation or the PACS workstation that's connected to the device, is generally left to do whatever people want. And so that could be running a slightly newer, I say slightly newer because, you have to keep getting patched. So you might be running a Windows 7 Service Pack 1 or whatever, but that could still have a lot of issues, and that could be the potential problem in your network. And the good news is those can be patched. Many of those can be patched through more traditional mechanisms because most of them are like generic workstations, not completely, but they have many of those characteristics. So those can be patched much more easily than you might be able to patch an actual medical device. And so the problem of actual risk management and patching is actually far lower than what providers think they are in the environment. And even within the high-risk devices, like I mentioned, if you understand how these vulnerabilities can be exploited, you have ways to mitigate the high-risk vulnerabilities without requiring a patch. Like I said, by understanding the exploit vector, you can take certain action. And Asimily does all of this as well. The challenge is, of course, where patching is absolutely required. Manufacturer approval is still going to be required. You will have a small subset of devices which you will need to patch. And so for those, you will still have to work with the manufacturers. Now, there are manufacturers who are getting, who are really good about this. Obviously, manufacturers who lag behind in this aspect. So you have to work with them. But if you do this kind of analysis, manufacturers generally struggle with the fact, especially medical device manufacturers, that they get bombarded with everything, all the requests that they need to be doing. But if you can give them a prioritized list of what needs to be solved for, which you cannot solve, because there will be issues which you cannot solve through any kind of mitigation. You might need to do a patch. There might be no other alternative in some cases to really secure it. So in those cases, if you can give them that prioritized list, it's a smaller list, and then it gives manufacturer a much more focused way of solving the problem. And maybe they have put some security mitigations in place to take care of it, which they can then provide you what they have done. But by giving them a much more focused list, you're also helping yourself, but you're also helping the manufacturer. You're also helping the community in trying to move forward this issue of risk management. And of course, this is also an ongoing effort. You have to continue to work with the manufacturers to build in security for new products. So with that, on the topic of risk, I have presented a few slides. And I wanted to talk about the topic of continuous monitoring, which is a topic many people confuse with risk. So I wanted to clarify that up front. But now in the topic of continuous monitoring, this is important as well, because now that you have proactively identified all your risks and you have said, okay, I'm going to take care of all the areas where the problem exists, you might still have that scenario where something is happening in your environment, you're not aware, a new attack happens, it just breaks through your, all the controls you put in place. So you need to continuously monitor. That's an essential part of any program. So to do that, you again have to follow, I would say, to monitor and block, you again have to look at 5 things. So the first one is baselining the device. Now, medical devices, unlike IT, they don't just, all behave the same way. Different medical devices behave differently. So you have to baseline every device, understand how the device operates, and, compare across similar devices to understand how they operate. So you have to baseline the device as step 1. Step 2 is understanding when something is going wrong or discovering anomalies. And I would say discovering anomalies can be done in different ways. So in the one way of doing it is you have pre-existing device profiles. Someone tells you that this device is doing X, and that, like, let's say an infusion pump is not supposed to go and access this particular service. So that by definition, the infusion pump is having an anomaly because the device profile of, let's say, BD infusion pump. So you now have discovered an anomaly. So that's one kind. You compare it with an existing profile. Another way of doing it is using machine learning, where you say, I will have the existing profiles, but I'm going to check how the device is behaving in that environment. Maybe in this environment, these set of infusion pumps behave slightly differently from some other set that I have seen because of some configuration that's done. And so I'm going to compare across similar devices using some machine learning techniques, and then I'm going to figure out when something is wrong. So that's another way of doing it. The third way of doing it is to say, okay, so the first 2 are, like I mentioned, are focused on the device side. Step 3, say, I'm going to look at the traffic and I'm going to say, is there something anomalous or, malicious or weird happening in the traffic itself? And I'm going to do that maybe by comparing across, all the different security models that I know. And when I look at the different security models, I'm actually going to figure out something malicious. So each of these obviously have their pros and cons. I won't have time to go into it, but the suffices to say that, a combination of all 3 is what you really would like to do, because each of them has certain strengths and weaknesses. So you want to combine all their benefits. And so you want to use all the techniques when you discover anomalies. Then the third piece is you also want to see whether if the device is misbehaving, could there be any operational issue on the device? And this is a harder one to see. You have to look for certain things. But, sometimes it's not often, but sometimes it could be the device is misbehaving, like I said in step 2, because of some form of operational issue. And so you have to understand whether that is potentially the cause, so that you don't have any false alarms and you're chasing down the right problems. So these 3 steps, baselining, discovering anomalies, and the operational part, are what you need to understand what's really happening in the environment. And then now that you're continuously monitoring it, you could choose to take action, because now you have, action is different from a patch. You might choose to take action that is like really blocking that issue, or taking some, segmenting or something like that. So there are 2 forms of action you can take. One is segmenting and the other is blocking. Now, I know many healthcare providers have what I call flat networks. Everything is on the same network: medical devices, IT devices, printers, everything. Sometimes even facility, as we have seen, devices on the network. And so people should do some segmentation. But the challenge of doing like very granular segmentation is not just doing the segmentation, but also maintenance. Because what we have seen is when providers say we have segmented the network, generally they might have started with the right intention, but they say we have a medical network and then we have an enterprise network. And then suddenly the medical network has more enterprise devices. And then the enterprise network has more medical devices than the medical network. So it's kind of strange. Maybe it was started the right way, but then devices creep in and suddenly, again, it becomes a flat network. So segmentation is definitely a useful tool. But what is important about segmentation is not just doing it, but maintaining it. And maintaining a segment can be actually even more challenging than doing the segmentation in the first place. And the last piece is blocking devices. Now, this is a more temporary solution. You see a problem, you see an attack, potentially, you say, I block it, you solve it till you actually figure out what needs to be done. Now, this can be done, it's a good tool. But again, you have to be careful. In the world of IT, hey, if you block a device, what's the worst that can happen? Someone complains that an email is not accessible. In the world of medical devices, hey, you block something, you can pretty much disrupt care. So you've got to be very careful when you block something, because you don't want to make a mistake when you block something on the network. Now, the good news is, obviously, there are pros and cons to these. So the good news is both segmentation and blocking can be done with your existing infrastructure. So the tools can integrate with your existing infrastructure. And they can not only detect, but they can also block and segment. Now, again, the difference with IT and medical is in IT, the reason to do this with specialized tools is in IT, there are challenges to doing anomaly detection in IT. I won't touch on those, but in general, most devices you can classify unusual device behavior and then classify as an anomaly. Like I mentioned, in medical devices, different devices behave differently. So you've got to be very careful on how you classify what's really an anomaly and then take action on it. And so for that, you have to compare across similar devices and classify. In world of IT, you can segment more easily. You can just put them in different segments. Something goes wrong, it goes wrong. You can fix it. In medical devices, if you remember in the first slide, I had spoken about device relationships, how the devices are connected and where it's connected. And that ties back in both to the risk where I spoke about topology, but it also ties back here because you have to know the relationships to be to really be careful with your segmentation. You don't want to block that imaging equipment from talking to your PAC server. You want to be careful on how these devices talk, because again, that could disrupt some form of data flow which you need for some regulatory purpose, or it could disrupt some operations. And with IT, you can easily block on the network. I already spoke about blocking. You have to be careful on the impact on operations. Now, the good news is there are solutions exist, and this is I would say slightly more mature than I would say step 2, which can baseline devices and discover anomalies. From what we have seen is, there's a lot of talk about cybersecurity and attacks on healthcare, and that is definitely a problem. But we have seen there are more misconfiguration issues rather than like real cybersecurity attacks happening. In most cases, I mean, I'm not undermining cybersecurity attacks; they do happen. But if you look at broadly, there are more misconfiguration issues. And one example is imaging equipment, where we see, the imaging equipment which should not be doing certain actions are generally doing those. And it's not like all imaging devices might be, browsing or doing some weird actions, but some subset of imaging equipment generally would be doing some form of, some kind of anomalous or what I say, misconfiguration kind of anomalous behavior on the network. So it's generally a misconfiguration issue rather than anything. And like I said, solutions can also help with segmentation and blocking, including Asimily. And so, like I said, the challenge is if you block it, you have to be careful about operational issues. Are you blocking when it's potentially in use? Medical devices are different from general IT. So network level utilization might not always give you an accurate measure whether the device is in use at that point in time. And I can explain this later, but if you want to block a device which is potentially in use, you don't want to block a device which is potentially in use, so you have to be careful on how you address that. And then, like I said, when you segment, it's not just when you do the segmentation, even as you continue to add new devices, you want to make sure that you are taking care of the relationship before you do anything. So what I see coming next is more of the patch management. You do the prioritization. I spoke about the last aspect of patch. So you really have to understand how do you know when a patch is available. That's generally a problem, and there are a number of issues around that. But to solve this, and it's a solvable problem, you don't have to live with it forever. But this does require like a deeper interaction between at least your key manufacturers, the healthcare provider, which is you, and many times the solution provider as well. And then compliance is a different aspect. Now, I don't have the time to talk about compliance on this call, but compliance is different from cybersecurity. You can be compliant but not secure, but not necessarily compliant. And if you want to be compliant, you have to understand, how you're compliant with the different frameworks. There are tools that exist for those, but they are fragmented. They are necessarily catered for medical devices. So there are other aspects to this that need to be taken into account as well. And so finally, as a conclusion, if you really want to manage your medical devices, especially on the cyber side, you have to understand the inventory. You have to understand all the different aspects about it. Second thing is you have to proactively identify your devices and mitigate risk. So proactive identification is important. And like I said, proactive is different from the reactive way of doing it. And then the third piece, and within that, like I said, it's possible even with all the patching constraints that people complain, and that is many times true, because there might be ways after you have prioritized your high risk and high vulnerable devices, there might be ways to solve the problem. In fact, there are ways to solve the problem in many cases where you don't have to do a patch, where you can still mitigate the issue. And the final piece is continuous monitoring and device baselining allows you to fix any existing incidents in the environment. And the good news is there are solutions which can do all of them, including two. Asimily is definitely one of them as well. There are challenges exist, like I mentioned, in all of them. It's not like you're going to have a silver bullet, but so you have to work on this. You have to work with both the vendors who understand the medical device cybersecurity problem and who have a roadmap to comprehensively address them. But you also have to continue to work with your suppliers, with your medical device manufacturers, because getting them involved in the problem and getting them actively engaged with you, especially your primary manufacturers, is going to be as important to solve the problem as well. So that's what I had today. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Shankar. Yes, we have a few questions that have come in. What kind of parameters can be derived from the network? Does it pose any operational risk to the devices?
Yes, that's a good starting question. So first of all, on the operational risk, no, you can do it without any operational risk to the device. You can, on the network, specifically on the network, you can passively extract the information, without scanning any device. And so there is no operational risk. So we get that out. And then in terms of parameters, now it depends from environment to environment, depends on devices in that environment, the configuration. So every environment could be different, but you generally would see a lot of parameters that I said, the IT parameters, the device type, the classification is important. So you want to know, which ones are there on the environment. You can know which ones have PHI, which ones are transmitting PHI. You can know a little bit about, wherever possible, about the brand, serial number, manufacturer. Sometimes cybersecurity capabilities, depending on what the device is doing, is important, how it's connected. So all of those are potentially extractable from the network. Now, whether in one environment you might see all the models for all the imaging, in the other environment you might not see models for some of the imaging, for example. It all depends from environment to environment, but you should be broadly be able to see a lot of parameters that you need to manage the device itself.
Okay, so how do we manage our risk when there are so many vulnerabilities for which manufacturers do not provide patches? I mean, for example, Spectra, vulnerability for stealing data still does not have a patch from many manufacturers.
Okay, so this goes back to my, so this question I think goes back to my point 2 that I mentioned. So I want to, I mean, for people who don't know Spectre, I mean, this was a vulnerability that came in, I think in Jan or March this year. And this effectively allows an attacker to steal, PHI from any device. And, Asimily themselves, we ourselves have tried this, and it's very easy to steal PHI from a device if you are affected by Spectre. And the problem is it lies in the hardware, and so it lies right very deep in the operating system. So pretty much most devices are affected by it. So in this kind of case, this is a classic example which talks about the risk prioritization. Now, if you go, so that's what I mentioned about Spectre is what is the general thing that you will read online. If you go online and read about Spectre and how scary it is. But if you go take a very deeper look, much deeper look at this problem, you will find that that many of these, including Spectre, is affected only under certain scenarios. So specifically, since the question is around Spectre, so Spectre, for example, from what I remember, is affected only when you do certain kinds of browsing using certain kinds of versions, and you have to land on certain kinds of websites to be, to be affected remotely. Locally, you can access it and you can solve it through access controls, but remotely, there are certain kinds of things that need to happen. So first, are you really affected by Spectre? Yes, the Spectre vulnerability is present, but are you really affected? Are you using the affected version of browser? Are you really browsing certain websites? I mean, if you determine all of that, you can make a determination on whether you really need to worry about it. And then what's really the impact? Because it's mostly around the confidentiality part of it. So which ones are more critical than others? What is the risk level? All the parameters that I said. If you take all of that into account, you'll find that in many cases, in many devices, Spectre is present, but it probably doesn't pose any risk, or if it poses a risk, the risk level is not high. Now, in those devices where Spectre is present, poses a high risk, and is definitely an issue. I mean, now that you know that Spectre is something that can be exploited through some form of browsing, now you can take certain actions for that vulnerability. You can take a more extreme action by just stopping that browsing, or you can just upgrade that particular version of the browser, not do a full patch, but just upgrade the browser. Or through our research, we have also discovered that there are ways to configure the browser. So you can browse, you can use an older version of browser, but there are ways to configure the browser in many cases. So that even ways to configure the browser so that you're not exploited. So here, this is an example where you have a high risk vulnerability, but you're potentially not at risk, and where you're at risk, you can take certain steps today that can mitigate the problem. So your PHI stays safe without having to wait for a patch from the manufacturer, which could take time, because this is a patch which is fairly challenging to do and which has a number of repercussions on the operations of the device. So this is an example. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. How can I justify the return on investment to my management for implementing a solution?
Oh, that's a good question. So this is a question that arises often from providers saying, hey, there's no budget, or there's a budget, but no, management doesn't really see, the major risk. So people usually say, I have to make a business case to justify to my management that I really need to spend or even need to use anything. Now, I would say the justification lies in different use cases, and you can take use case by use case. Like inventory has its own value, because if you don't know, first of all, I want to take a step back, right? Ultimately, you're solving for patient care in this. So, but I do realize sometimes when people say we are solving for patient care, it's not. There are deeper questions on this, and so they don't necessarily get the justification internally. So you can take use case by use case. So procurement, for example, knowing your inventory is a critical step in procurement and planning. If you know that if you have 100 devices of a given kind, it probably puts you, which are connected, it allows you to manage and understand what your inventory is. Now, if you couple that with asset utilization, then you know that 100 devices utilize only like 30% of the time or 50%. You know how much spare excess inventory you have in your environment, which allows you to better procure a plan. So that's a use case in itself, which actually can justify. The other point about patching and mitigation, people look at it from a cyber perspective, but it has huge operational implications, because you can say, hey, I know how to prioritize my devices. I can eliminate those devices which don't need necessarily an upgrade or a patch this year. And so I can save on a lot of procurement costs or operational costs, which I would have otherwise incurred by paying a Microsoft or by going and paying the manufacturer, just because I have to now upgrade because my operating system is old or doesn't have a patch for that vulnerability. So by understanding the risk in your environment specifically, it's not like general thing, you have to know in your environment. You can say, okay, if I can narrow down from that 100 devices to 10% or 20 or even 30 or even 40, whatever the number might be, but if I can narrow down, I am eliminating a large percentage of devices where I would have had to spend the time and effort either patching or upgrading or doing some form of operational maintenance or going to some third-party provider like a Microsoft or something, paying them. And so there you can save in significant in patching and operational costs if you understand what the specific devices which pose a risk are. And then, of course, with things like anomaly detection, it's a little harder, but you can just justify that continuous monitoring allows you to solve misconfigurations and any other issue. So you can make solid business cases which have operational value, looking at like asset utilization, patch management, risk management, and then, of course, continuous monitoring.
Okay, we've got time for about one more question. It's as a biomed, I perform regular PMs on all medical devices. Is any standard checklist available to check cybersecurity of the devices?
Okay, this is a good one and a tough one, because the thing with regular PM check is, the way I understand regular PM check is, you check whether the device is operating well. The problem with some of the cybersecurity issues is, for many years I have researched into these, and some of these are effectively what they call stealth. So they sit on the device for some time, they're gathering data stealthily, you probably don't notice much difference, and one fine day you see the problem. Or you have an old operating system, you don't see anything, and then suddenly there's an issue. I would say, look, if you're a PM if you're a biomed doing regular PM maintenance, so I would say, you probably want to make sure the device is operating all your parameters. So hopefully the device is in operation, all your parameters right now. Nothing is hopefully going wrong on the device. Like I said, there could be something stealth happening on the device, you will not know, but at least right now the device is operating within parameters, nothing is happening. If you're doing a regular maintenance, understanding what's on the device, maybe the inventory on the device is probably part of that. And if you're doing that PM maintenance, you can do a checklist on saying, is the device operating within parameters? Do I know what's really on this device? Maybe the operating system, which might be easy to check if you have access physically to the device, the software on the device. If I know the operating system software, are there any specific major vulnerabilities that have been published for those? And then you can go check with the manufacturer. Now, you can do a full risk analysis and find that that's not an issue. But without that, you can just check whether you know the software. Are there any major published vulnerabilities? You can ask the manufacturer or do a quick check. You will know online. And then if there is, go check with the manufacturer whether something is available for those. So I would say just, making sure they're operating within parameters, which I'm sure all of you are doing. Knowing what's there on the device when you have physical access, much easier to actually get that information. Then making sure you can ask the manufacturer, do a quick check with the manufacturer if there's anything you should be knowing about this set of parameters on the device, if there's something you should be worried about, or is it everything fine? And then finally, if there is something that is potentially a problem, then whatever the manufacturer recommends, if they have something, they'll do it. I would say if you do that checklist, it will actually help you with the issue. It will obviously increase the work slightly, but at least for your critical devices, high capital equipment, it might be worth that checklist. And then, of course, you can then later on do a more thorough analysis.
Okay, that's great. We're coming up to our hour. So Any questions we didn't have time to ask Shankar, I will be sending straight to him afterwards to answer offline. So thank you once again, Shankar, for such a great webinar, and thank you again to today's sponsors, Asimily. One lucky attendee will win an Amazon gift card for completing the post-webinar survey, which will appear on your screen shortly. You must complete the survey to obtain your certificate of attendance. For more information about our upcoming webinars, please visit our website, webinarwednesday.live. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.